my name is Lynn-Ellin, and I will be discussing about Behaviorism's Chapter 11, which is titled The Self and Others. So this chapter kind of starts off with a reminder of this history of animism, which is kind of this idea that there is some innate person, entity, being, spirit, soul, whatever, inside of us that is dictating our actions and our behaviors. He titles this the indwelling spirits that control our actions, and he talks about how historically disruptive or negative spirits were kind of linked with, oh, there's a demon or the devil is working inside of this person, or if there was a creative action, it was seen as being a muse or a genius, or you could say like a ancestor, some kind of spiritual guide, something like that. So he talks, of course, about the behaviorist shift away from this animism to more of seeing humans as what he calls a locus. So he defines this as a point at which many genetic and environmental conditions come together in a joint effect. So instead of having this spirit inside of us, the soul inside of us that's dictating what we're doing, we actually are just a bunch of different processes working together for one being. He gets into the idea of knowing yourself, which is a predominant feature of this chapter. And he compares this to the idea of being mad at yourself, and saying who does what to who. So if we don't have like this person or this spirit inside of us that's controlling our actions, then how can we say that we know ourselves or that we're mad at ourselves? Like, you are mad at you doesn't really make sense. So the rest of the chapter is him breaking down this idea of self-knowledge, self-control, and how we interact with the selves of others. So kind of coming back to this idea of just the self and what is really going on. Why are we perceiving this idea of a self? So he talks about how the concept of self-knowledge is unique to humans, and that we can behave and know that we are behaving in a certain way for a certain reason, which is uniquely human as far as we know. But he also talks about the idea that communities can produce different kinds of self-knowledge. And so this is kind of a reflection of the idea that self-knowledge could actually be under certain environmental contingencies. So he kind of gives the example that certain communities, and I thought of communities as being like families or just the environment in which a person is raised. So certain communities may be more aware of impulses and more emphasize self-control, so more reinforcing that behavior that's governed by certain rules. Whereas others may encourage or reinforce acting on impulse, so going out and being a little bit more wild and free and kind of that concept. So this shows how self-knowledge can fall under the same contingencies. So some communities might promote the self-knowledge of your own impulses and being able to control them based on certain rules, whereas other communities might promote the knowledge of your innate tendencies to go out and do different things in the world and promote that instead. He talks about the idea of an identity crisis, and how this is considered not knowing yourself, but essentially just not understanding your behavior, not recognizing your own behavioral patterns, is what creates that identity crisis. Then he talks about how we talk about ourselves when we're in a state of distress. We typically would ask somebody else, how do you feel? Instead of asking them, why do you feel that way? Or more specifically, like, what in your environment has caused this response? And he says that it is particularly useful for us to shift from this internal introspective idea to asking questions about the environmental contingencies that are producing certain responses. So saying, what in the environment is causing me to behave in the way that I am expressing this certain emotion? Then he kind of shifts into the idea of how we're interacting with others, interacting with different selves. Kind of talking about empathy and that discussion of emotional expression. He talks at first about how knowing another person is really about our ability to predict their outward behavior. He then goes into talking about how instead of taking on the emotions of others, we imagine based on their verbal behavior how we would behave, and then we're able to kind of pair our own emotions with that. So it's actually made me think of an article from the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis that I just read a couple of days ago that's talking about emotions in behavior analysis, and I'll keep it really short because I'm supposed to be talking about Skinner, but I got really excited. But it's from 1998, and it basically says that our verbal behavior that we pair with certain events in which we've experienced those emotions that we're verbally expressing, that verbal behavior can then be conditioned with those actual events. So verbal behavior can produce the same physical response as the event itself. And so I thought about this in the context of what Skinner's saying, is that if somebody is saying, I feel anxious, our form of empathy is actually to pair that verbal behavior with times in which we have said, I am anxious, and think about what that emotional response would be. So then he talks about how we can observe why emotions are expressed through behavior through changing the contingencies, which shows how emotional expression, how that verbal behavior is still under the same behavioral contingencies. He gives the example of someone who acts bravely when weakness is punished. So maybe they're in an environment where you're supposed to act brave, but you can kind of change those contingencies and have them act afraid in a certain context. So I thought of maybe in the presence of a loved one, like we might act brave in certain environments, but then when acting afraid is reinforced by the attention and the communication that we have with others, we might then kind of not act as brave. So in the context of empathy then, he talks about the meaning of emotional expression can be different across speakers and across learners, which makes sense, and it kind of goes back to the point that I was talking about earlier with verbal behavior, that your verbal behavior of saying, I am anxious, isn't necessarily going to translate exactly to what that verbal behavior means to me. So he then says, going off of that words and phrases to describe private events are not exact, so interpretation can vary across speakers and across learners. And the only way to understand exactly what someone is going through is if you pass through the same history of that learner, which makes sense. So then he talks about the idea of acting empathetically. I don't think he actually ever uses the word moral, but to me this seemed like he's talking about moral behavior and how we act altruistically and morally with other people. And so he says that this is behavior that is reinforced by its impact on others. So this idea of moral behavior, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, makes a lot of sense. Modern branches of moral behavior psychology talk quite a bit about this. It's actually called the tit for tat theory of moral development, which is really cool. It's cool to see Skinner talking about this in the 70s before we really had any idea that moral behavior could be scientific in some way. So it's cool to see that. Then he kind of wraps up this section by talking about how these internal states and these feelings and this knowledge of the self and others, while we might not understand every aspect of it, especially like the biological and physical responses that are happening, that does not mean that they don't fall under the same contingencies. So kind of a reoccurring theme with Skinner, just because we don't understand it entirely doesn't mean that it doesn't fall under the same contingencies. So he kind of breaks down the next section into a lot of different little ways that we interact with our own self or with the selves of others. He talks about self-management as a concept, how this is often seen as changing one's emotions. So like gives the example of change your mind, have willpower, stop being anxious. But what does that really mean? He says that it would be useful for us to start actually analyzing the contingencies in the environment that are shaping our behavior and applying rules to that behavior instead of just talking about it in these abstract emotional states and feelings. He talks about some examples of times that we have rule-governed behavior. He gives the example of the golden rule. He gives the example of resolutions, how they're like self-made rules that govern our behavior to avoid aversive stimuli or tempting environments where we might behave in a way that we don't want ourselves to. He gave a really interesting example, I thought, of the idea of self-management and kind of, it seemed like resilience in a way, he's defining that as someone getting through like a really difficult time is their personal history having more control over their current environment. He gave the idea of concentration camps, or he didn't give the idea, he gave the example of concentration camps, saying how the people who were able to survive these horrific circumstances didn't let their personal environment, as we would say, break their will, but essentially didn't let their personal environment be the contingency that shaped their behavior. They instead acted in line with their personal history of bravery and strength and that kind of behavior. So I thought that was interesting. I'm going to kind of go through the next section as quickly as possible, but he basically ends the chapter breaking down examples of different kinds of interactions with others. So he talks about teaching. We know all about that. I could definitely relate to it as somebody who practices ABA. So he said teaching is the idea of contriving contingencies to promote the acquisition of useful behavior. We all know that. He did say that teaching facts and skills should fall under the same contingencies as teaching productive thinking, creativity, other abstract thoughts, which kind of reminded me of some of the discussions that we had last week. So that was cool. He talks about helping someone kind of be their best self, self-actualize. It really comes down to advising favorable contingencies. He gives the example of a talk therapist and how they can discuss the rules governing someone's behavior and how to better contact reinforcement in their own environment, so helping them have that self-knowledge of their behavior. He argues against humanist psychology, which made me sad because I like humanist psychology, but then reading this I was like, okay, that makes sense. He argues that we should not, or he doesn't argue, humanist psychology argues that we should not control, but we should only help and guide others towards self-actualization. But then Skinner argues against that, saying that, well, how can you change somebody's behavior unless you're controlling their environment and these contingencies in some way? So that makes sense. Talks about governing people, how we have rules in place for our behavior, which are typically controlled by the threat of punishment or controlled by monetary reinforcement. Makes sense. We got laws. If you break the law, you go to jail. Also, we all have jobs, or we have some source of income or some way to get money so that we can get things. That's how society is. Then he ends that section talking again about entertainment and creativity. And he talks about how not only is the artist reinforced by creating the art, but the person observing and buying the art is also reinforced by that exchange, and then them buying the art reinforces the artist, so it's this reciprocal relationship between selves. And so in summary, he says that we first learn how to control others in infancy through our behavior. We're babies, we cry. When we cry, we get food. We learn that pretty quickly. And then we learn how to shape our environment through following the rules that we're taught that are governing our behavior. And then lastly, we finally learn how to control the self through analyzing contingencies that shape our behavior. So, it was a lot. But that made me think, for my question that I was going to ask, it made me think that Skinner talks a lot about this concept of self-knowledge. Obviously, he kind of breaks down that it's not really the self, but, we're using that word to kind of sum it up. The concept of self-knowledge and essentially self-awareness, and how understanding our environment shapes our own behavior to better contact reinforcement. So my question is, how exactly and to what extent does this self-knowledge allow us to manipulate our own environment and behavior? And how does this concept still reflect his notion of pure determinism, that we don't have the free will to control our behavior? So I thought of the example, and I'd love to break down. So say I become self-aware by recognizing that I am being manipulated by the contingencies of societal norms that are dictating me to wear certain normal clothing. I recognize that, and then because I recognize that, I shift my behavior away from that social reinforcement and instead begin dressing like wild and avant-garde and like wearing pattern suits and look like somebody out of a movie, because I no longer want to fall under the societal norms. Who is really controlling who? So I realize my environment, these social norms, were controlling my actions, and then I change my behavior against it. So who or what is now controlling my behavior? I hope that makes sense. But yeah, that's something that I'm still kind of wrestling with. Like, how much can we control our behavior through self-knowledge, and what does that say about determinism, is essentially what I'm getting at. So anyway, I know this is a little bit over, so I'm sorry. I don't know what to say. It was a dense chapter, as they all are. So looking forward to hear what you guys have to say in the discussion. Thanks for watching all the way through this.